A biblical perspective on life, culture and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
On a Thursday, we like to check in with Andrew McColl. He's the Family Voice Australia Queensland State Director. Andrew, a special welcome back to 2020.
Good morning, Neil, and good morning, listeners.
Okay, Andrew, you've been reflecting on change of government. We're talking mature thoughts around government, and that is Christian thoughts around government. Your own home state of Queensland. Where do you want to start here? Because there's been a change of government.
Well, there certainly has, Neil. The LNP needed to win 47 seats in the parliament to form a government in their own right, and now they've got 53 seats. So the question for all of us, I suppose, or at least some of us, Neil, should be asking, will they be any better than Labor? Well, the very least we can say is, let's hope so.
Okay.
The new government that we have in Queensland has inherited a truckload of debt. I'm pleased that the new Treasurer, David Janetsky, wants to address the issue. He'll have some work to do, cutting back on spending in as many areas as possible. He could start by encouraging parents to homeschool their children, taking complete responsibility for their education. Let's just say that 50,000 Queensland parents with an estimated 100,000 school-aged children took this up. It costs about $25,000 for a child's public school education annually. If the Treasurer provided these parents $3,000 per child to do this, that would mean a saving to the taxpayer of $22,000 per child each year for 100,000 children. That equates, Neil, to $2.2 billion annually. Would our Treasurer like that help to his bottom line?
It's an interesting and, I think, dimension that perhaps most people don't think of at all as to whether the thought of homeschooling might actually be a budget repair issue. That's pretty challenging for some people to think of homeschooling like that, but homeschooling could save the state a huge amount of money. That's worthy of consideration. Hey, when you're talking about a mature view of government, I mean, nobody's talking about those sorts of things when there's an election campaign. Perhaps there needs to be someone taking up that as a policy campaign measure. But what are the thoughts that you might have around, the economics, those sorts of things that we might reflect on that we vote for when our states are going to the polls, and then bringing a biblical foundation to how those sorts of things work? How do you reflect on that?
Well, just talking about homeschooling and the fact that that would save the taxpayer $22,000 a year per child, say in Queensland or New South Wales or any state really, kind of alludes to the matter of there being some relationship between ideology, that is what we think and how we think, and economics. We read in John's Gospel, chapter 2, verses 14 and 15, Neil, that Jesus turned over the tables of the money changers and poured out their coins, making a scourge of cords, which is a kind of a whip, of course, and drove them out of the temple. He knew what he was about, confronting religious corruption. But things have changed since then. Actually, things have changed even from when Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher were dominant 40 years ago. Reagan had rhetoric, but no results. Thatcher had both. She was willing to confront her opponents, to take them on in debate. That got them riled and angry. They came after her in the parliament, but she courageously stood up to them because she knew what she was about. So the Labor Party, trade unions, Argentina, even the IRA, one after another they took her on, one after another she triumphed. Despite the weakness of those behind her, she was brave and stood her ground. She had their measure. She was right about Brexit too. Don't we need more like her? Yes, but she actually believed that her Christian convictions had practical consequences, so she believed in smaller government, less tax, and more freedom, and she worked towards those things. But work and and personal responsibility if that freedom is going to last. Now, of course, for those in our community who believed in socialist perspectives on society and on government, that the government really can look after you, Margaret Thatcher seemed uncaring, dangerous and awful. But look at England now, disappearing into a dark hole with no relief in sight of hiked taxes and government oppression of those it deems worthy of it. And that's almost anyone. One man's in jail today for 18 months. For what? Producing a documentary. It must have been terribly destabilising to the community that was made up of interviews. So respect for the individual and the rule of law? I don't think so. That's all being swallowed up by the rule of an elite that's making the rules, it seems, now in England. But we know from the last 100 years that every socialist enterprise always ends up the same. Broken dreams, big debts, and hurt people. And as von Mises commented many years ago, whoever wants lastingly to establish good government must start by trying to persuade his fellow citizens and offering them sound ideologies. There's no hope left for a civilization when the masses favour harmful policies.
All right. Often it comes down to policies and what each side of a election campaign can cut through and deliver to the people. If you're talking about sort of basic type things, I mean, those are big issues you're talking about there, and people who've held ideological positions. And when you mentioned Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, you know, for some of us, they're a little bit out of our memory, but they were staunch conservatives. And as you point to, quite significantly, you know, smaller government, less tax, more freedom was where they stood. And you're contrasting that with the socialist perspective where, you know, big spending government has the answers to all your problems. If we're getting down to some basics for what's going on in the state of Queensland, how do you reflect on those sorts of principles and how they might be, you know, even potentially working out in the Queensland government?
Well, there are some positives, Neil, for Queensland for us to be considering now. There has been a change of government, and it's not just a change of government. There is a change of attitude, at least to some degree. Firstly, we've got the Katter Party with 3 MPs in the Parliament, and they are wanting to bring the Babies Born Alive bill back to the Parliament next year. Now, that's got some potential to bring about some big surprises. Secondly, there's an X factor with the Queensland LNP backbenchers. How many are pro-life? Quite a number. Will they punch above their weight? Well, that's hard to tell at this stage. And thirdly, the new government's exposed Labor's fraudulent economics and tossed out Labor's sweetheart deal with the CFMEU, which was costing Queenslanders millions annually. So that's to be commended. Now, it's true the LNP is haunted by the one-term wonder ghosts of Campbell Newman. They want to tread carefully, and we can understand that. But the danger is that they won't confront ballooning debt. They won't challenge the community, that government spending cuts are critical and debt must be paid back. Queensland needs parliamentarians that behave like adults. And that will be essential to get back on the path of reform of the state's finances. So we stop thinking that government resources are unlimited. They're not. Do we think we can really have ballooning government debt and a prosperous state, not to speak of 50-cent train fares? No, we can't. And as Rushdoony commented so many years ago, because debt is so deeply rooted in sin and idolatry, debt and its consequence, inflation, are especially morally and religiously destructive. An inflationary society is an immoral and a degenerate society, and it will see as its natural concomitant every other kind of depravity flourish.
Okay, and we often don't think of debt as the big bogeyman in the room, but you're identifying that and giving that a Christian foundation too, that Christians need to be aware of debt. And sometimes when we are talking about debt, we're talking about our own debts and whether we're in too deep with our mortgage or the cost of living crisis, and we're talking about how we deal with those sorts of things. But at the governmental level, governments are always faced with these things too, and this is not just the state of Queensland. Debt is rife right around our nation and into our federal parliament, our federal governance as well. So as Christian believers, what is your encouragement here about understanding these sorts of things? Because I guess what we're saying here, and maybe you're putting the boot in more one side than the other, but one side is much the same as the other, I think we can all agree.
Well, yes, and what we should be encouraging, or what we should be reminding ourselves about, Neil, is that the essential but often missing word from today's political vocabulary is responsibility. And that applies personally, and for the family, and for the church, and for the nation. Amongst other things, that means a steady and relentless assault on debt in its many forms. Now, the term the Razor Gang was coined in the 1980s concerning a bunch of federal MPs who were given the task of looking for ways to reduce government expenditure. What a great idea. Why don't we have a Queensland version of the Razor Gang? Saved monies would pay down state debt. Wouldn't that be great? Every department could have its expenditure examined carefully and cuts made wherever possible. How many costs could be saved, one department after another? And in the midst of this, there are changes to be made in relation to many government departments, such as family services, health and education, that would give us a much more conservative and family environment for raising a family. And these are the kinds of things that I think most Queensland families want.
Queensland families will want that. Some of the elites that we sometimes talk about, the inner city elites, people who perhaps are not raising children, not having a family, don't care about family values. What you're saying is that people who have families maybe need to stand up a little stronger and say, we're expecting our governments to do family-friendly things, and what you do with our national debt or our state debt might be equally as important as anything else you do. In conclusion, how can we draw some loose ends together? What are your thoughts around, we're talking about the Queensland government. What's some more on the Queensland government as we draw some loose ends together here?
Well, what we can see, Neil, is that Queenslanders want greater responsibility from their government. Now, the LNP has to prove that they've got what it takes. There are lots of changes that can be made for better government in many departments so that we truly do have smaller government, less tax and more freedom. And it all begins with individuals, families and churches caring for those who cannot defend themselves and not expecting government to do it all. Hey, wouldn't that be a good idea?
Okay, not expecting government to do it all, and as you, I think, rightly identify, those who lean to the socialist side of government, expect government to have all the answers. Those who perhaps lean the other way may be thinking exactly the same thing, but the Christian perspective on all of that is let's not put our faith in the government, let's put our faith in God and look for those godly principles that we glean from Scripture, as in His revelation to humanity, that those things might be a very good foundation to be able to build life and government on. Andrew McColl.
Absolutely.
Andrew is the Family Voice Australia State Director for the state of Queensland. You can connect with Andrew at familyvoice.org.au. Andrew's written a whole bunch of books too. Let me just rattle through a few of those titles. They Shall Become One, The Significance of the Godly Family, Inherit the Earth, which was written for mid-high school students back in 2018, and The Great Christian Revolution, a series of 11 studies dealing with some of the applications of the Christian worldview. So some considered thoughts there, and not everyone will likely agree with everything, but wow, when you actually say homeschooling might be a way to actually affect a budget repair, that might capture our imagination. Andrew McColl, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us again today on 2020.
Thank you, Neil. Always a pleasure.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.